My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months left. Lung cancer, probably from all those cigarettes I smoked, trying to forget what I did in Vietnam 50 years ago. But before I meet whatever judgment awaits me, I need to tell someone the truth about Operation Wandering Soul, about the ghost tapes, about what we did to those young men in the jungle. I'm 72 years old now, sitting in my study in suburban Ohio, surrounded by books I'll never finish and photographs of a family that barely knows me. My wife passed 5 years ago, and my children, well, they stopped trying to understand their father's silences long ago. The only witnesses to my confession are the ghosts that have haunted me for half a century. For 50 years, I've carried this secret. The government classified everything we did, swore us to secrecy, told us we were heroes who helped end the war faster. But heroes don't wake up screaming at 3 in the morning, hearing voices they helped create echoing through their dreams. Heroes don't spend decades drowning their guilt in isolation. I was a specialist in the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, United States Army. My job was to operate audio equipment for what the military called innovative communication strategies. What we actually did was create fake ghost voices to terrorize enemy soldiers by exploiting their deepest spiritual beliefs. We called them the ghost tapes. The operation was based on Vietnamese cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife. Our intelligence officers had learned that Vietnamese soldiers feared few things more than the spirits of improperly buried dead, souls condemned to wander eternally, unable to find peace. So we decided to weaponize that fear. We recorded voices speaking in Vietnamese dialects, pretending to be the spirits of dead soldiers calling to their living comrades. We created audio of crying children, pleading mothers, and ancestral spirits demanding that soldiers abandon their posts and return home. Then, we played these recordings through speakers hidden in the jungle, usually at night when the psychological impact would be strongest. The military told us we were saving lives, that psychological warfare was more humane than conventional combat, that breaking enemy morale would end the conflict faster with fewer casualties on both sides. We believed them because we wanted to believe them. We were young, patriotic, and convinced that we were serving a righteous cause. But what we really did was torture people's souls. I watched through night vision scopes as enemy soldiers broke down upon hearing what they believed were the voices of their dead friends and family members. I saw grown men weep, pray, and flee in terror from sounds we had manufactured in a recording studio. We turned their love for their ancestors, their respect for the dead, their deepest spiritual convictions into weapons against them. And we told ourselves it was justified because they were the enemy. The operation was considered highly successful by military standards. Intelligence reports documented numerous enemy desertions and surrenders following our psychological operations. Units would abandon strategic positions after hearing the ghost tapes, convinced that angry spirits were warning them away. Some soldiers reportedly suffered complete psychological breakdowns, becoming catatonic or developing what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. We measured our success in broken minds and shattered faith. I've spent 50 years trying to forget the faces of the young men we terrorized. Faces I saw through binoculars and night vision equipment as they reacted to our manufactured supernatural experiences.
Most were barely older than I was. Teenagers and young men who had been drafted into a war they probably didn't understand any better than we did. But the faces that haunt me most are those of my fellow operators. Good men who followed orders and did their duty, just like I did. Men who came home carrying the same guilt, the same nightmares, the same questions about what we had become in service to our country. The government has never officially acknowledged the full extent of Operation Wandering Soul. Some details have emerged through declassified documents and veteran testimonies, but the complete truth remains buried in classified files. The men who operated the ghost tapes have been forgotten by history, left to carry our secrets alone. Until now. I'm telling this story because I'm running out of time, and because I believe people need to understand what psychological warfare really means. Not the sanitized version presented in military histories, but the human cost of weaponizing belief, faith, and love. What we did in Vietnam was pure evil. And I've spent 50 years learning to live with that truth. Now it's time to share it. I was 20 years old when the Army decided I was perfect for psychological warfare. It was March 1968, and I had just finished basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. Like most draftees, I expected to be assigned to infantry, artillery, or some other conventional military role. The Vietnam War was escalating, and young men like me were being shipped overseas as fast as the military could train us. But my background made me different. Before the draft, I had been studying electrical engineering at Ohio State University and working part-time at a local radio station. I knew how to operate audio equipment, understood electronics, and had experience with recording technology. When the Army reviewed my file, someone decided those skills could be useful for something other than carrying a rifle through the jungle. The letter came on a Tuesday morning. Report to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for specialized training in communications and psychological operations. I had no idea what psychological operations meant, but it sounded better than infantry combat. My parents were relieved that their son might be serving in a technical capacity rather than on the front lines. I was naive enough to think I was lucky. Fort Bragg in 1968 was a sprawling complex of training facilities, classified research centers, and administrative buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly across the North Carolina landscape. The Psychological Operations Training Center was tucked away in a restricted section of the base, surrounded by chain-link fences and guards who checked identification multiple times before allowing entry. My training class consisted of 12 soldiers, all selected for specific skills or backgrounds. There was Rodriguez, a former radio DJ from Los Angeles who spoke fluent Spanish. Williams had studied anthropology at Berkeley before being drafted. Chen was a Chinese-American translator who had grown up speaking multiple Asian languages. We were an unusual collection of college students, technicians, and specialists who had been pulled from conventional military training for reasons we didn't yet understand.
Our commanding officer was Colonel Harrison, a career military man in his 40s who had served in Korea and specialized in what he called innovative warfare strategies. He was soft-spoken, intelligent, and had the kind of calm authority that made you want to trust him. During our first briefing, he explained our mission in terms that made it sound almost noble.
"Gentlemen," he said, standing before a map of Southeast Asia, "you have been selected for a program that could help end the Vietnam conflict faster and with fewer casualties on both sides. We are developing communication strategies that target enemy morale rather than enemy bodies. Your job will be to help us implement psychological operations that encourage surrender and reduce the need for conventional combat." He made it sound like we were going to save lives. The training lasted 8 weeks and covered subjects I had never imagined the military would teach. We studied Vietnam's history, culture, and religious beliefs. We learned about ancestor worship, the importance of proper burial rituals, and the Vietnamese concept of wandering spirits. We were taught basic Vietnamese phrases and trained to recognize different regional dialects. Most importantly, we learned about the psychological impact of audio manipulation. Our instructors explained how sound could be used to create emotional responses, how cultural beliefs could be leveraged for strategic advantage, and how psychological pressure could be more effective than physical force. We practiced operating sophisticated recording equipment, learned to edit audio for maximum psychological impact, and studied the principles of what they called cultural warfare. The training felt academic, almost scholarly. We were told we were learning to understand our enemy's mindset so we could communicate with them more effectively. The word manipulation was never used. Instead, our instructors spoke about influence operations and morale adjustment techniques. I remember feeling proud to be part of something that seemed so much more sophisticated than conventional warfare. We weren't being trained to kill people, we were being trained to understand them, to communicate with them, to convince them that fighting was futile. It felt like a more civilized approach to conflict resolution. The closest we came to understanding the true nature of our mission was during a lecture on cultural pressure points. Colonel Harrison explained that every society had beliefs and fears that could be exploited for strategic advantage. He used examples from World War II, describing how Allied forces had used propaganda to demoralize German and Japanese troops by targeting their cultural anxieties. The key, he said, is to understand what your enemy values most and then convince them that continuing to fight threatens those values. Sometimes the most effective weapon is not a bullet, but an idea. Even then, I didn't fully grasp what we were being prepared to do. It wasn't until we received our orders for Vietnam that Colonel Harrison finally explained Operation Wandering Soul. We were going to create audio recordings that would convince enemy soldiers they were hearing the voices of their dead comrades and ancestors. We would use their spiritual beliefs against them, turning their love for their families and respect for their ancestors into psychological weapons. By then, it was too late to refuse. We had been trained, briefed, and sworn to secrecy. We were soldiers following orders, and our orders were to wage war against the human soul.
I boarded the transport plane to Vietnam, believing I was serving my country honorably. I had no idea I was about to become something I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget. The heat hit me like a physical blow when I stepped off the transport plane at Da Nang Air Base in April 1968. It wasn't just the temperature, though that was oppressive enough, but the humidity that seemed to wrap around you like a wet blanket, making every breath feel thick and labored.
The air carried smells I had never experienced. Jet fuel mixed with tropical vegetation, cooking fires, and something else I couldn't identify, but would later learn was the constant presence of fear and tension that permeated every American installation in Vietnam. Da Nang was chaos. Helicopters thundered overhead in constant rotation. Cargo planes roared down runways carrying supplies and reinforcements, and everywhere you looked, there were soldiers, vehicles, and equipment in perpetual motion. The base felt like a small American city that had been dropped into an alien landscape, complete with mess halls, barracks, and recreational facilities that seemed surreal against the backdrop of an active war zone. But I wasn't staying at Da Nang. After 2 days of processing and orientation, I was loaded onto a smaller transport helicopter along with Rodriguez, Williams, and Chen. Our destination was a classified facility about 30 miles northwest of the main base, hidden in the mountains near the Laotian border. The pilot, a young warrant officer who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, told us we were heading to Fire Base Echo, a designation that didn't appear on any official maps. The helicopter ride gave me my first real view of Vietnam beyond the military installations. Below us stretched a landscape of incredible beauty. Emerald rice paddies, dense jungle canopies, and mountain ranges that disappeared into misty horizons. It was hard to reconcile this natural paradise with the war being fought across its surface. Fire Base Echo turned out to be unlike any military installation I had seen during training. Instead of the sprawling complexes at Fort Bragg or Da Nang, this was a compact, heavily fortified compound built into a mountainside clearing. The entire facility was surrounded by multiple layers of defensive barriers, guard towers, and what appeared to be sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. Most unusually, the base was almost completely silent. Unlike the constant noise and activity of conventional military installations, Fire Base Echo operated with an eerie quiet that felt deliberate and unsettling. Soldiers moved with purpose, but spoke in hushed tones. Vehicles were equipped with mufflers that reduced engine noise to whispers. Even the helicopters that occasionally landed seemed to approach with unusual stealth. I learned later that the entire facility was designed to minimize acoustic signatures that might reveal its location or purpose to enemy forces operating in the surrounding mountains. Our commanding officer at Fire Base Echo was Major Kellerman, a thin, intense man in his 30s who had been running psychological operations in Southeast Asia for 3 years. He met our helicopter personally, which I took as a sign of the importance placed on our mission. "Welcome to the 6th Psychological Operations Battalion, Detachment Alpha," he said as we gathered our equipment. "What you'll be doing here is classified at the highest levels. You will not discuss your work with anyone outside this facility. You will not write about it in letters home, and you will not acknowledge its existence even to other military personnel unless they have specific clearance. He led us to a briefing room built into what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been expanded and reinforced with concrete. The walls were lined with maps, photographs, and technical diagrams that I didn't yet understand. At the center of the room was a large table covered with audio equipment, recording devices, and stacks of documents written in Vietnamese. "Gentlemen," Major Kellerman continued, "you are now part of Operation Wandering Soul. Your mission is to create and deploy audio materials designed to exploit enemy cultural beliefs and encourage surrender or desertion. The techniques you'll be using are based on extensive research into Vietnamese spiritual practices and psychological vulnerabilities." He gestured to the equipment on the table. "This is some of the most advanced audio technology available to the military. You'll be creating recordings that will be played through speaker systems deployed in the field, targeting specific enemy units with messages designed to undermine their morale and fighting effectiveness." Rodriguez raised his hand. "What kind of messages, sir?" Major Kellerman's expression grew serious. "Messages from the dead, Sergeant. You'll be creating the voices of spirits, ancestors, and fallen comrades calling to enemy soldiers from beyond the grave. The Vietnamese believe that souls without proper burial become wandering spirits condemned to eternal restlessness. We're going to use that belief to convince them that continuing to fight will anger the spirits of their ancestors." The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. We weren't just going to wage psychological warfare. We were going to weaponize grief, faith, and love itself. Looking back, that moment in the briefing room was when I should have refused. When I should have requested a transfer, accepted a court-martial, or found some way to avoid participating in what I was beginning to understand was a profound violation of human dignity. Instead, I nodded and said, "Yes, sir." The recording studio at Fire Base Echo was built inside a natural cave system, its walls lined with acoustic foam and sophisticated audio equipment that seemed impossibly advanced for a military installation in the middle of a war zone. The setup was more professional than anything I had worked with at the radio station back home. Multiple microphones hung from adjustable booms, mixing boards with dozens of channels and controls, and tape machines that could layer multiple audio tracks with precision. The military had spared no expense in creating a facility capable of producing audio that could pass for supernatural communication. Our first week was spent learning the technical aspects of our mission. Sergeant Rodriguez, with his radio background, quickly mastered the mixing equipment. Williams, our cultural specialist, worked with Vietnamese translators to develop scripts that would sound authentic to native speakers. Chen focused on dialect coaching, ensuring that our recordings would be recognizable to soldiers from specific regions of North and South Vietnam. My job was to operate the primary recording equipment and manage the technical quality of our productions. The process of creating the ghost tapes was more complex than I had imagined. We weren't simply recording people speaking Vietnamese phrases. We were crafting elaborate audio experiences designed to convince listeners they were hearing genuine supernatural communication.
Our voice actors were a mixture of Vietnamese refugees who had fled to South Vietnam and American soldiers who had learned the language during previous tours. The refugees were told they were helping create propaganda materials to encourage enemy surrender, which was technically true, though it didn't capture the full scope of what we were doing. The scripts Williams developed were heartbreaking in their emotional manipulation. We created messages supposedly from dead soldiers calling to their living comrades. "Brother, why do you continue fighting when your family needs you at home? I am cold and alone in the spirit world because my body was not properly buried. Come home so that you can honor the dead and care for the living."
We recorded mothers calling to their sons, "My child, I have been waiting for you to return. Your father grows old and weak. The rice fields need tending. Why do you stay in the jungle when your ancestors call you home?" The most disturbing recordings featured the voices of children, supposedly the spirits of young family members who had died while their fathers or brothers were away fighting. These messages were designed to exploit the deepest guilt and grief that soldiers carried about being separated from their families during times of crisis. But the voices were only part of the production. We layered each recording with ambient sounds designed to enhance the supernatural atmosphere. Wind through bamboo forests, distant temple bells, the soft crying of women, and whispered prayers created an audio landscape that felt otherworldly. We used electronic effects to make voices sound ethereal and distant, as if they were truly coming from beyond the grave. The technical sophistication was remarkable. We could adjust the frequency response to make voices sound like they were coming from underground or floating in the air above. We added reverb and echo effects that made speech seem to emanate from vast, empty spaces. We even incorporated subsonic frequencies, sounds below the range of human hearing that could create feelings of unease and dread without listeners understanding why. Rodriguez became particularly skilled at creating what we called environmental integration. He would record the natural sounds of specific jungle areas where our tapes would be played, then mix those ambient sounds into our productions so that the supernatural voices would seem to emerge naturally from the landscape itself. The cultural research that went into our work was extensive and deeply troubling. Williams had compiled detailed information about Vietnamese funeral practices, ancestor worship, and beliefs about the afterlife. We learned that Vietnamese soldiers carried photographs of their ancestors and regularly performed rituals to honor the dead. We discovered that the fear of becoming a wandering spirit, a soul unable to find peace due to improper burial, was one of the most profound anxieties in Vietnamese culture. And we used all of that knowledge to create psychological weapons. Our first completed recording was a 15-minute audio piece featuring the supposed voice of a North Vietnamese soldier who had died in a recent battle near the DMZ. Using intelligence gathered from captured documents, we had learned the names of several soldiers who had been killed in action. We created a script in which one of these dead soldiers called to his former unit, describing his suffering as a wandering spirit and begging his comrades to abandon their positions and return home to perform proper burial rites.
The voice actor we used was a young refugee from Hanoi whose own brother had been killed fighting for the North Vietnamese army. He delivered the lines with such genuine emotion that even those of us who knew it was fabricated found ourselves moved by the performance. The pain in his voice as he spoke about being separated from his family, about dying far from home without proper burial, was heartbreakingly authentic. When we finished the recording and played it back through our speaker system, the effect was genuinely unsettling. Even knowing that we had created every element of the audio, hearing those voices emerge from the darkness of the cave felt supernatural. The combination of cultural authenticity, emotional manipulation, and technical sophistication created something that transcended mere propaganda. We had created a weapon that attacked the soul.
Major Kellerman was pleased with our work. "This is exactly what we need," he said after reviewing our first production. "Audio that doesn't just communicate with the enemy, but reaches into their deepest fears and beliefs. This will be more effective than any conventional weapon." As I watched him approve our recording for field deployment, I felt a mixture of professional pride and growing moral unease. We had succeeded in our mission, but I was beginning to understand what that success really meant. Our first field deployment took place on a moonless night in May 1968 in the mountains near the Cambodian border, where intelligence had identified a North Vietnamese army staging area. The mission team consisted of myself, Rodriguez, and 2 infantry soldiers who would provide security while we set up our equipment. We traveled by helicopter to a landing zone about 3 miles from the target area, then hiked through dense jungle, carrying our audio equipment in specially designed backpacks that distributed the weight across our bodies. The speaker system we used was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Instead of a single large speaker that would be easy to locate and destroy, we deployed multiple smaller units connected by buried cables. This created a distributed audio field that made it nearly impossible for listeners to pinpoint the source of the sounds. The speakers themselves were camouflaged to look like rocks or fallen logs, blending seamlessly into the jungle environment. Setting up the system took nearly 4 hours of careful work in complete darkness. We used night vision equipment and communicated through hand signals to avoid making any noise that might alert enemy forces to our presence. Every cable had to be buried, every speaker positioned for optimal acoustic effect, every connection tested to ensure the system would function properly when activated. The control station was established about 500 meters from the speaker array, hidden in a natural depression that provided both concealment and a clear line of sight to the target area. From this position, we could observe enemy reactions through night vision scopes while operating our equipment remotely. At 0200 hours, we began the first playback of Operation Wandering Soul. The recording started softly, distant wind sounds and barely audible whispers that could easily be mistaken for natural jungle noises. Gradually, the volume increased and the voices became more distinct. The supposed spirit of a dead North Vietnamese soldier began calling to his former comrades, his voice echoing through the darkness with an otherworldly quality that made even me feel uneasy. "Brothers, why do you remain in this place of death?" the voice pleaded in Vietnamese.
I am cold and alone, wandering without rest because my body lies unburied in foreign soil. My mother weeps for me, but I cannot comfort her. My ancestors call to me, but I cannot answer. Come home so that you may honor the dead and care for the living. Through our night vision equipment, we could see the enemy camp about 800 meters away. At first, there was no visible reaction. Soldiers continued their normal activities, maintaining equipment, standing guard, moving between positions. But as the recording continued and the voices became more insistent, we began to observe changes in behavior. Guards stopped their patrols and stood motionless, apparently listening to sounds they couldn't identify or locate.
Soldiers emerged from their shelters and gathered in small groups, pointing toward different areas of the jungle as they tried to determine where the voices were coming from. Some appeared to be praying or performing what looked like protective rituals. The most disturbing reaction came when we played the second part of our recording, the voice of a supposed dead child calling to his father. The high, plaintive voice of a young boy echoed through the darkness. "Father, why did you leave me? I am frightened and alone. The spirits of our ancestors are angry because you fight instead of caring for your family. Come home, Father. Come home before it is too late." Several enemy soldiers dropped to their knees at the sound of the child's voice. Through our scopes, we could see men weeping, their shoulders shaking with emotion as they listened to what they believed was supernatural communication from their dead children. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Rodriguez, monitoring the audio levels, whispered into his headset, "Target is responding. Multiple individuals showing signs of distress, continuing playback as planned." But watching those men break down emotionally made me feel sick to my stomach. These weren't faceless enemies or military targets. They were human beings, fathers and sons and brothers, being tortured by manufactured voices that exploited their deepest love and grief. The recording continued for 30 minutes, cycling through different voices and messages designed to create maximum psychological impact. We played the supposed voices of dead comrades, deceased family members, and angry ancestors, all calling for the soldiers to abandon their positions and return home. The audio was layered with environmental sounds that made the voices seem to come from the jungle itself, as if the very landscape was haunted by restless spirits. By the end of the playback, the enemy camp was in chaos. Soldiers were abandoning their positions, gathering their equipment, and preparing to move. Some appeared to be performing elaborate rituals, possibly attempting to appease the spirits they believed were haunting the area. Others simply fled into the jungle, leaving their weapons and supplies behind. The mission was considered a complete success by military standards. Intelligence reports later confirmed that the entire North Vietnamese unit had abandoned their staging area and retreated across the Cambodian border. No shots had been fired, no American lives had been lost, and a strategic enemy position had been neutralized through psychological pressure alone. But as we packed up our equipment and prepared to return to base, I couldn't stop thinking about the faces I had seen through the night vision scopes. The tears, the terror,
the desperate prayers of men who believed they were being haunted by the spirits of their dead loved ones. We had achieved our objective, but at what cost? During the helicopter ride back to Firebase Echo, Rodriguez tried to rationalize what we had done. "It's better than killing them," he said over the noise of the rotors. "We broke their will to fight without spilling blood. That's more humane than conventional warfare." But I couldn't shake the feeling that what we had done was worse than conventional combat. We hadn't just attacked their bodies or their military capabilities. We had attacked their souls, their faith, their most sacred beliefs about death and family and spiritual obligation. We had turned their love into a weapon against them. And we were just getting started. The success of our first mission led to an immediate expansion of Operation Wandering Soul throughout the region.
Within 2 weeks of our initial deployment, Major Kellerman received orders to increase production and begin targeting specific enemy units with customized psychological operations. What had started as an experimental program became a systematic campaign of spiritual warfare that would eventually affect thousands of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers across multiple provinces. The escalation required us to develop more sophisticated and personalized recordings. Our intelligence sources began providing detailed information about specific enemy units, including the names of soldiers who had been killed in recent battles, the home villages of active personnel, and even personal details about family members and local customs. This intelligence came from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and reconnaissance missions that seemed designed specifically to support our psychological operations. With this information, we began creating what Williams called targeted spiritual interventions, recordings that referenced specific dead soldiers by name, mentioned particular villages and families, and incorporated local dialects and cultural references that would be immediately recognizable to intended listeners. The process of creating these personalized recordings was deeply disturbing. We would receive intelligence reports that might include information like Sergeant Nguyen Van Duc, 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, killed by artillery fire on May 15th, originally from village of Pu Lac in Quang Nam Province, survived by wife and 2 young children, unit morale reportedly low following his death. Using this information, we would create a recording featuring the supposed voice of Sergeant Nguyen calling to his former comrades. The script would reference specific details about his life, his family, and his death, making the supernatural communication seem authentic and personal. "My brothers in the 3rd Company," the fabricated voice would say, "this is Nguyen Van Duc speaking to you from the spirit world." I died in the artillery attack near Hill 875, and my body was never recovered for proper burial. My wife Lynn weeps for me in Phu Loc village, and my children ask why their father does not come home. I am trapped between worlds, unable to find peace because you continue fighting instead of honoring the dead. The emotional impact of these personalized messages was devastating. Intelligence reports following our deployments described enemy soldiers becoming catatonic upon hearing the supposed voices of their dead comrades. Some units experienced complete psychological breakdown, with soldiers refusing to fight, abandoning their positions, or developing what military psychiatrists would later recognize as severe trauma responses. But the most disturbing development was our creation of family tapes, recordings that featured the supposed voices of dead relatives calling to specific soldiers. These productions required extensive research into individual soldiers' family histories. Our intelligence sources would provide information about deceased parents, siblings, or children, which we would use to create recordings of these dead family members calling to their living relatives in the enemy forces. I remember one particularly haunting recording we created for a Viet Cong unit operating in the Mekong Delta. Intelligence had identified a squad leader whose young daughter had died of illness while he was away fighting. We created a recording of the child's voice calling to her father, describing her loneliness in the spirit world and begging him to come home to care for her mother and perform proper burial rites. The voice actor was a young Vietnamese refugee whose own daughter was approximately the same age as the dead child. She delivered the lines with such genuine maternal emotion that everyone in the recording studio was moved to tears.
The final recording was heartbreaking. A child's voice pleading with her father to abandon his military duties and return home to honor her memory. When this recording was deployed in the field, the targeted squad leader reportedly suffered a complete psychological breakdown. According to intelligence reports, he was found by his own men sitting alone in the jungle, weeping and talking to empty air as if his dead daughter was present. He was evacuated by his unit and never returned to combat. We had destroyed a man's mind by weaponizing his grief for his dead child. The technical sophistication of our operations also increased dramatically during this period. We developed mobile speaker systems that could be deployed by special forces units operating deep in enemy territory. We created time-delayed playback devices that would activate hours after deployment, making it impossible for enemy forces to locate and destroy the equipment before the psychological operation began. Most significantly, we began incorporating real-time intelligence into our operations. Radio intercepts and surveillance would provide information about enemy unit movements and morale, allowing us to deploy our recordings at moments when they would have maximum psychological impact. For example, if intelligence indicated that an enemy unit had recently suffered casualties and was experiencing low morale, we would immediately deploy recordings featuring the supposed voices of their dead comrades. If surveillance detected that soldiers were discussing their families or expressing homesickness, we would target them with family tapes designed to exploit those emotional vulnerabilities. The military effectiveness of these operations was undeniable. Enemy units targeted by Operation Wandering Soul showed significantly higher rates of desertion, surrender, and psychological casualties compared to units that had not been exposed to our recordings.
Some areas became completely abandoned by enemy forces, who apparently believed the locations were haunted by angry spirits. But the human cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Intelligence reports described enemy soldiers developing what appeared to be severe mental illness following exposure to our recordings. Some became convinced they were being followed by ghosts. Others stopped eating or sleeping, and many exhibited symptoms that we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. We were creating psychological casualties on a massive scale, and we were doing it deliberately.
Rodriguez tried to maintain his rationalization that psychological warfare was more humane than conventional combat, but even he was beginning to show signs of stress. Williams, our cultural specialist, became increasingly withdrawn as he learned more about the spiritual beliefs we were exploiting. Chen, who had to listen to our recordings repeatedly to ensure linguistic accuracy, began having nightmares about the voices we had created. And I was starting to understand that we weren't just waging war against enemy soldiers. We were waging war against the fundamental human capacity for faith, love, and spiritual connection. We had become something monstrous, and we were getting better at it every day. The turning point came when Williams showed me a book he had borrowed from the base chaplain, a study of Vietnamese religious practices written by a French anthropologist who had lived in Indochina for 30 years. We were sitting in the mess hall during a rare break from recording sessions, and Williams looked exhausted. He had been working 18-hour days developing culturally authentic scripts, and the strain was showing in his hollow eyes and trembling hands. "Tom," he said quietly, sliding the book across the table, "I need you to read Chapter 7. About ancestor worship and the concept of wandering souls."
The chapter Williams wanted me to read was titled "The Sacred Obligation to the Dead." As I worked through the dense academic prose, I began to understand the true magnitude of what we were doing. According to the anthropologist, Vietnam culture was built around the fundamental belief that the living had sacred obligations to the dead. Proper burial rituals weren't just religious ceremonies. They were essential spiritual practices that ensured the deceased could find peace in the afterlife and continue to protect their living descendants. The concept of wandering souls, spirits condemned to eternal restlessness due to improper burial, represented one of the deepest fears in Vietnam society. These lost spirits were believed to suffer constant anguish, unable to join their ancestors or find peace. Worse, their spiritual torment could affect the living, bringing misfortune, illness, and death to families who failed to honor their obligations to the dead. But what struck me most powerfully was the anthropologist's description of how these beliefs shaped Vietnam attitudes toward family, duty, and sacrifice. Soldiers fighting far from home carried the constant anxiety that they might die without proper burial, condemning their souls to eternal wandering. This fear wasn't just personal. It extended to their obligations to deceased family members whose spirits required ongoing care and remembrance. We weren't just exploiting superstitions or cultural quirks. We were attacking the fundamental spiritual framework that gave meaning to Vietnam life. "Do you understand what this means?" Williams asked when I finished reading. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he kept glancing around to make sure no one could overhear our conversation. "We're not just using psychological tactics," I said, the full implications finally sinking in. "We're committing spiritual warfare against people's most sacred beliefs." Williams nodded grimly. Every recording we create violates something these people consider holy. We're not just pretending to be dead soldiers. We're claiming to be souls in torment, spirits who can't find peace because of improper burial. In their belief system, that's not just deception, it's blasphemy. The weight of this realization was crushing. I had been telling myself that we were simply using cultural knowledge to encourage enemy surrender, that psychological warfare was more humane than conventional combat. But the truth was far more disturbing. We were desecrating the most sacred aspects of Vietnamese spiritual life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk thinking about the enemy soldiers we had targeted, imagining their terror upon hearing what they believed were the voices of their tormented dead. I thought about the cultural specialist who had explained that Vietnamese soldiers often carried photographs of their ancestors and performed daily rituals to honor deceased family members. We had turned those acts of love and remembrance into weapons against them. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Major Kellerman. I had decided to express my concerns about the moral implications of our operations, hoping that someone in command might share my growing unease about what we were doing. Kellerman listened patiently as I explained my research into Vietnamese spiritual beliefs and my concerns about the ethical dimensions of Operation Wandering Soul. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an expression I couldn't read. "Specialist Mitchell," he said finally, "I appreciate your thoroughness in understanding our enemy's cultural background. That kind of detailed knowledge is exactly what makes our operations effective." "Sir, with respect, I'm not talking about effectiveness. I'm talking about whether what we're doing is right." Kellerman's expression hardened. What we're doing is following orders and serving our country. Our mission is to end this war as quickly as possible with minimum casualties to American forces. If exploiting enemy cultural beliefs accomplishes that objective, then it's not only right, it's our duty. But sir, we're not just exploiting cultural beliefs. We're attacking their most sacred spiritual practices. We're making them believe their dead relatives are suffering eternal torment. And that psychological pressure is causing them to surrender or desert rather than continue fighting, Kellerman replied, which means fewer American soldiers die in combat. That's the only moral calculation that matters in wartime. I tried to explain that there had to be limits to what we were willing to do, even in war. That some tactics were so fundamentally wrong that they corrupted the people who used them, regardless of their strategic effectiveness. But Kellerman cut me off. "Specialist, you're suffering from what we call operational stress. It's common among personnel involved in psychological operations. You're overthinking the moral complexities of a straightforward military mission." He assigned me to 3 days of rest and evaluation with the base psychiatrist, who diagnosed me with adjustment difficulties related to unconventional warfare exposure. The psychiatrist, a kind but overworked captain, explained that many soldiers struggled with the psychological demands of operations that didn't involve conventional combat. "You're not killing people directly," he said, "but you're still engaged in warfare, and that creates psychological stress. The important thing is to remember that you're serving a larger purpose, ending the conflict and saving American lives." But I knew the problem wasn't stress or adjustment difficulties. The problem was that I was finally understanding what we had become. We weren't soldiers fighting for freedom or democracy. We were technicians of spiritual torture, using our skills to attack the deepest beliefs and fears of human beings who loved their families and honored their ancestors just as we did. And we were getting better at it every day. The mission that broke me took place in August 1968, near the ancient city of Hue, where intelligence had identified a North Vietnamese army unit that had been operating in the region for over a year. This particular unit had become a priority target because they had been highly effective at disrupting American supply lines and had successfully evaded multiple attempts at conventional engagement. Our orders were to deploy a comprehensive psychological operation designed to force their withdrawal from the area. The intelligence package we received for this mission was more detailed than anything we had worked with before. It included not just unit composition and recent casualties, but personal information about individual soldiers that had been gathered through months of surveillance and interrogation of captured personnel. Among the intelligence was information about a young soldier named Pham Van Minh, barely 18 years old, who served as a radio operator for the unit. According to captured documents, Minh's younger brother had died of illness 6 months earlier, while Minh was away fighting. The boy had been only 14 years old. Williams and I were ordered to create a personalized recording targeting Minh specifically, using the voice of his dead brother to encourage desertion. The script we developed was heartbreaking in its emotional manipulation. The supposed voice of Minh's dead brother would call to him from the spirit world, describing his loneliness and fear, begging his older brother to come home and care for their grieving parents.
"Brother Min," the fabricated voice would say, "why do you stay in the jungle when our parents weep for both their sons? I am cold and frightened in the spirit world, and I cannot find peace because you are not home to honor my memory. Our mother grows thin with grief, and our father ages beyond his years. Come home, brother. Come home before you lose everyone you love." The voice actor we used was a young Vietnamese refugee whose own brother had been killed fighting for the South Vietnamese army. As he delivered the lines, tears streamed down his face. The pain in his voice was so authentic that even our hardened audio technicians were visibly moved. When we finished the recording and played it back, the effect was devastating, even to those of us who had created it. The combination of cultural authenticity, personal details, and genuine emotional pain created something that transcended mere propaganda. It was a weapon designed to destroy a young man's soul. The deployment took place on a moonless night in late August. Our team established the speaker array in the jungle surrounding the enemy position, and at 0300 hours we began the playback. Through our night vision equipment, we could observe the enemy camp as the recording played. At first, there was no visible reaction, but as the voice of the supposed dead brother became more insistent, we began to see movement. A young soldier emerged from one of the shelters and stood motionless in the center of the camp, apparently listening to the voice calling his name. Even from our observation position, 600 meters away, we could see that he was trembling. "Target acquired," Rodriguez whispered into his headset. Individual matching description of primary target showing strong response to audio stimulus. But as I watched through my scope, I realized I was looking at a child. Pham Van Minh was 18 years old, according to our intelligence, but he looked younger. A thin, frightened boy who was probably fighting in this war because he had no other choice, just as I was fighting because I had been drafted.
He stood alone in the darkness, listening to what he believed was the voice of his dead brother, and his entire body shook with grief. The recording continued for 20 minutes, cycling through different emotional appeals designed to maximize psychological impact. The supposed voice of the dead brother described his suffering in the spirit world, pleaded for proper burial rites, and begged men to abandon his military duties and return home to care for their parents. By the end of the playback, Min had collapsed to his knees and was weeping openly. Other soldiers from his unit gathered around him, apparently trying to comfort him, but he seemed inconsolable. Through our audio monitoring equipment, we could hear him calling his brother's name and speaking to empty air, as if the dead boy was present. The mission was considered a tactical success. Intelligence reports later confirmed that men had deserted his unit the following night, abandoning his equipment and disappearing into the jungle. His unit, demoralized by his breakdown and convinced that their position was haunted by angry spirits, withdrew from the area within 48 hours. But watching that young soldier's psychological destruction through my night vision scope was the moment I finally understood what we had become. We weren't warriors fighting for freedom or democracy. We weren't even soldiers engaged in conventional combat.
We were technicians of psychological torture, using our skills to destroy human beings by attacking their capacity for love, faith, and spiritual connection. I had watched an 18-year-old boy's mind break under the weight of manufactured grief, and I had helped create the weapon that broke it. During the helicopter ride back to Firebase Echo, I sat in silence while Rodriguez and the other team members discussed the mission's success. They talked about psychological impact, tactical effectiveness, and strategic implications. But all I could think about was the image of that young soldier kneeling in the darkness, weeping for a brother whose voice we had stolen and used against him. When we returned to base, I requested an immediate meeting with Major Kellerman. I told him I could no longer participate in Operation Wandering Soul, that what we were doing violated every moral principle I had been raised to believe in. Kellerman listened patiently, then explained that my request for transfer was denied. I had been trained in highly classified techniques, had access to sensitive intelligence, and possessed knowledge that made me a security risk if I were reassigned to conventional duties. "You'll complete your tour with this unit," he said firmly. "That's not a request, Specialist. That's an order." I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, forced to continue participating in operations that I now understood were fundamentally evil. And there were still 8 months left on my deployment. I completed my tour in Vietnam in March 1969, but I never really came home. The flight from Da Nang to Travis Air Force Base in California took 18 hours, but the journey from soldier to civilian would take decades, and in some ways, it never ended at all. I carried Operation Wandering Soul with me like a virus, infecting every aspect of my life for the next 50 years. The Army processed my discharge with efficient indifference. I received my separation papers, a bus ticket to Ohio, and a stern reminder that everything I had done in Vietnam was classified and could never be discussed with anyone lacking proper security clearance. The psychological operations I had participated in were considered so sensitive that even acknowledging their existence could result in prosecution under the Espionage Act. I was forbidden from seeking therapy for experiences I couldn't describe, from discussing my service with family members who wanted to understand why I had changed, from finding any kind of community with other veterans who might share similar guilt and trauma. I was alone with my secrets. The nightmares began during my first week home. Every night I would hear the voices we had created echoing through my dreams, the fabricated spirits calling to their living relatives, the manufactured grief we had used as a weapon, the authentic pain of the voice actors who had helped us create our psychological torture devices. But worse than the voices we had recorded were the voices I imagined, the real spirits of the soldiers we had driven to madness, the actual ghosts of the children whose deaths we had exploited, the genuine ancestors whose sacred memory we had desecrated for military advantage. I began drinking heavily, not to celebrate my return home, but to silence the voices that followed me from Vietnam. Alcohol provided temporary relief from the guilt and shame that consumed my waking hours, but it also isolated me further from family and friends who couldn't understand why their son and brother had returned from war as a stranger.
My parents tried to help, but how could I explain that I was haunted by the ghosts of people I had never killed, but whose souls I had tortured? How could I tell them that I had spent a year weaponizing the most sacred beliefs of human beings who loved their families just as much as we loved ours? I attempted to return to college, using my GI benefits to enroll at Ohio State University, where I had been studying before the draft. But I couldn't concentrate on engineering coursework when my mind was filled with memories of audio equipment used for psychological warfare. I couldn't sit in lectures about electronics when every circuit diagram reminded me of the sophisticated recording systems we had used to create fake ghost voices. I dropped out after one semester and took a job at a factory, hoping that physical labor might provide some relief from the mental anguish that consumed me. But even mindless work couldn't silence the voices or ease the guilt that grew stronger with each passing year. The worst part was the isolation. Other Vietnam veterans could share their experiences with combat, with losing friends, with the moral complexities of conventional warfare. But I couldn't tell anyone what I had really done in Vietnam. I couldn't explain that my trauma came not from being shot at or seeing friends die, but from participating in operations that attacked the human capacity for faith and love. I was a veteran of a war that officially didn't exist, carrying guilt for actions that had never been acknowledged. The drinking got worse throughout the 1970s. I lost jobs, relationships, and eventually my connection to my family. My parents died in the early 1980s without ever understanding why their son had returned from Vietnam as a broken man. My siblings tried to maintain contact, but I was too ashamed to let them see what I had become. I married twice during those years, but both relationships failed because I couldn't explain the nightmares, the guilt, the voices that haunted me. How could I tell a woman I loved that I had spent a year torturing people's souls? How could I build a life with someone when I believed I deserved to suffer for what I had done?
The 1980s brought some stability when I found work as a night security guard, a job that allowed me to avoid most human contact while providing enough income to support my drinking. I worked alone in empty office buildings, walking through darkened hallways and listening to the silence that reminded me of the jungle nights when we had deployed our psychological weapons. But even in isolation, the guilt continued to grow. I began researching Vietnamese culture and religion, trying to understand the full magnitude of what we had done. The more I learned about ancestor worship, proper burial practices, and the spiritual significance of honoring the dead, the more I understood that Operation Wandering Soul had been a form of cultural genocide, an attack on the fundamental beliefs that gave meaning to Vietnamese life. We hadn't just used psychological tactics against enemy soldiers. We had committed spiritual warfare against an entire people's relationship with their ancestors, their dead, and their most sacred traditions. By the 1990s, I was drinking myself to death, and I welcomed it. Death seemed like the only escape from the guilt that had consumed my life.
I had no family, no friends, no purpose beyond the daily struggle to silence the voices that reminded me of what I had become in service to my country. I was ready to die, and I believed I deserved whatever judgment awaited me. But then, something happened that changed everything. The government began declassifying documents related to psychological operations in Vietnam, and for the first time in 25 years, I learned that I wasn't alone. In 1995, the Pentagon released a batch of declassified documents related to psychological operations in Vietnam, and for the first time in 27 years, I saw official acknowledgement that Operation Wandering Soul had actually existed. The documents were heavily redacted, with most operational details blacked out, but they confirmed the basic framework of what we had done. The military described it in sanitized language as audio-psychological operations designed to exploit enemy cultural beliefs regarding death and burial practices. They made it sound like an academic exercise rather than the systematic spiritual torture it had actually been. But buried in the bureaucratic language were references to other units, other operators, other soldiers who had participated in similar programs throughout Southeast Asia. For the first time since returning from Vietnam, I realized I wasn't the only person carrying this particular burden of guilt and shame. I began reaching out to veteran organizations, carefully probing for others who might have been involved in psychological operations. The process was delicate. I couldn't directly mention classified programs, but I could ask general questions about audio equipment, cultural warfare, and unconventional missions. Slowly, I began to connect with other men who had served in similar capacities. There was Rodriguez, my old audio engineer, who had spent 30 years working as a radio technician while battling alcoholism and depression. Williams, our cultural specialist, had become a college professor but suffered from severe anxiety and had never been able to form lasting relationships. Chen, our translator, had committed suicide in 1987, leaving behind a note that mentioned voices that wouldn't stop calling. We began meeting informally, usually at VFW halls or veteran centers, ostensibly to discuss general Vietnam experiences, but actually to share the specific guilt and trauma that came from psychological warfare operations. These conversations were the first time any of us had been able to discuss what we had really done in Vietnam. The relief of finally talking about Operation Wandering Soul was overwhelming, but it was also devastating. Hearing other men describe their own experiences with creating ghost voices, targeting specific enemy soldiers, and watching psychological breakdowns through night vision scopes confirmed that our operations had been far more extensive than I had realized. Rodriguez told us about missions where entire enemy units had been driven to madness by recordings of dead children calling to their fathers. Williams described intelligence reports of North Vietnam soldiers who had become catatonic after hearing the supposed voices of their deceased wives. Another operator, a man named Thompson, who had worked in the Mekong Delta, shared stories of Viet Cong fighters who had committed suicide rather than continue living with what they believed was spiritual persecution from angry ancestors. We had been part of a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had affected thousands of enemy soldiers across multiple provinces and years of operations. The scope of what we had done was staggering, and the human cost was beyond calculation. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when Williams shared research he had conducted into the long-term effects of our operations on Vietnamese society. He had been corresponding with anthropologists and historians who had studied post-war Vietnam, and their findings were heartbreaking. Many Vietnamese veterans of the war continued to suffer from what appeared to be severe psychological trauma related to supernatural experiences during combat. Some believed they were being haunted by angry spirits. Others had developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves from ghostly persecution. And many had never been able to reintegrate into civilian society because they believed they had been spiritually contaminated by their wartime experiences. We had created psychological wounds that had never healed, spiritual trauma that had been passed down through families and communities for decades after the war ended. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. It was one thing to carry guilt for what we had done to individual soldiers during specific operations. It was another thing entirely to understand that we had participated in cultural warfare that had damaged an entire society's relationship with death, spirituality, and ancestral memory. Our informal support group began meeting regularly, and we developed what we called accountability sessions, structured conversations where we would acknowledge specific operations, discuss their human impact, and try to process the moral weight of our actions. These sessions weren't therapy in any conventional sense, but they provided a framework for confronting the truth about what we had done. We also began researching ways to make amends, though the options were limited. The Vietnamese government had no interest in acknowledging American psychological operations, and most of the specific soldiers we had targeted were either dead or impossible to locate. We couldn't apologize to the people we had harmed because we didn't know who they were or where they might be. But we could bear witness to what had happened.
We could ensure that the truth about Operation Wandering Soul was preserved, even if it couldn't be officially acknowledged. We began documenting our experiences, creating detailed accounts of specific operations, and preserving evidence of the psychological warfare programs that the military preferred to keep classified. This documentation process was both therapeutic and traumatic. Writing about specific missions forced us to confront memories we had spent decades trying to suppress. But it also provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from our lives since Vietnam. We weren't just carrying guilt anymore. We were carrying responsibility for ensuring that the truth about psychological warfare was preserved for future generations. The work was slow and painful, but it gave meaning to our suffering. If we couldn't undo the harm we had caused, we could at least ensure that it was remembered and understood. And perhaps, in some small way, we could prevent similar operations from being conducted in future conflicts. But even as we worked to document the truth about Operation Wandering Soul, I knew that accountability and historical preservation weren't the same as redemption. Some actions can't be forgiven, even by those who commit them. In 2003, I made a decision that would consume the remaining years of my life. I would research every aspect of Operation Wandering Soul and document the full scope of what we had done, regardless of the personal cost. The process began when I gained access to the National Archives through a researcher's permit, ostensibly to study general psychological operations in Vietnam. Most of the documents related to our specific missions remained classified, but I could piece together information from related files, unit histories, and cross-referenced intelligence reports. What I discovered was far worse than I had imagined.
Operation Wandering Soul hadn't been a limited experiment conducted by a few specialized units. It had been a comprehensive psychological warfare program that operated across multiple military branches and civilian agencies throughout the Vietnam conflict. The techniques we had developed at Firebase Echo had been replicated and expanded by dozens of other units operating throughout Southeast Asia. The scope was staggering. Between 1967 and 1972, psychological operations units had conducted thousands of audio deployments targeting North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces across South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The recordings we had created had been mass-produced and distributed to conventional military units, who used portable speaker systems to deploy ghost voices during routine patrols and combat operations. But the most disturbing discovery was that our techniques had been adapted for use against civilian populations. Declassified CIA documents revealed that psychological operations specialists had created recordings targeting Vietnamese civilians in contested areas, using supposed voices of dead family members to encourage support for South Vietnamese government forces. These operations had been conducted in villages, refugee camps, and urban areas where the distinction between combatants and non-combatants was deliberately blurred. We had weaponized grief and spiritual belief not just against enemy soldiers, but against entire communities of people whose only crime was living in a war zone. The research also revealed the extent to which our operations had been coordinated with other forms of psychological warfare.
The ghost voices were often deployed in conjunction with leaflet drops, radio broadcasts, and what the military called black propaganda, false information designed to demoralize enemy forces and civilian populations. The cumulative effect had been a systematic assault on Vietnamese culture and spiritual beliefs that went far beyond anything I had understood during my service.
Through veteran networks and online forums, I began connecting with former psychological operations personnel from other units and time periods. Many had stories similar to mine. Young soldiers who had been recruited for specialized training, told they were serving a noble cause, and gradually introduced to operations that violated their moral principles. But I also connected with soldiers who had participated in even more disturbing programs. One former operator told me about missions where they had used recordings of crying babies to lure enemy soldiers into ambush zones. Another described operations where they had broadcast the supposed voices of dead children to demoralize civilian populations in areas controlled by the Viet Cong. Most disturbing were the accounts of operators who had been ordered to create recordings using the actual voices of captured prisoners, who were forced to record messages that would later be used against their own units. These prisoners were told they were creating propaganda materials to encourage surrender, but their voices were actually being used to create fake ghost communications that would terrorize their former comrades. The psychological impact on the operators themselves had been devastating. Of the 47 former psychological warfare specialists I was able to contact, 12 had committed suicide. 23 suffered from severe depression or anxiety disorders, and most had struggled with alcoholism, failed relationships, and an inability to reintegrate into civilian society. We had been casualties of our own operations, damaged by the moral weight of what we had been ordered to do. But perhaps the most important research I conducted involved the long-term effects of our operations on Vietnamese society. Through academic contacts and cultural exchange programs, I was able to connect with Vietnamese scholars who had studied the psychological impact of the war on their own people. Their findings were heartbreaking. Many Vietnamese veterans continued to suffer from what appeared to be spiritual trauma related to supernatural experiences during the war. Some believed they were being haunted by angry ancestors who disapproved of their military service. Others had developed elaborate protective rituals to ward off ghostly persecution. Many had never been able to participate in traditional ancestor worship practices because they feared spiritual contamination from their wartime experiences. The psychological warfare we had conducted had damaged not just individual soldiers, but the cultural and spiritual fabric of Vietnamese society. We had attacked beliefs and practices that were fundamental to Vietnamese identity, creating wounds that had been passed down through generations. One Vietnamese scholar I corresponded with described our operations as cultural genocide, a systematic attempt to destroy the spiritual beliefs that gave meaning to Vietnamese life. He explained that the concept of wandering souls represented one of the deepest fears in Vietnam culture, and that our exploitation of this belief had created lasting trauma that affected entire communities.
The research consumed 5 years of my life and confirmed my worst fears about what we had done. Operation Wandering Soul hadn't been a limited military operation. It had been a comprehensive assault on human dignity, spiritual belief, and cultural identity. And I had been one of its architects. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, but it also provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life since Vietnam. If I couldn't undo the harm we had caused, I could at least ensure that the truth was preserved and understood. In 2010, at the age of 62, I traveled to Vietnam as part of a veteran reconciliation program organized by a non-profit organization that facilitated healing dialogues between former enemies.
The decision to make this trip had taken me 3 years to finalize. I knew I couldn't reveal my specific role in Operation Wandering Soul due to ongoing classification restrictions, but I hoped that visiting Vietnam might provide some opportunity for acknowledgement, if not forgiveness, of what we had done. The flight from Los Angeles to Ho Chi Minh City took 24 hours, but the emotional journey felt much longer. I carried with me a folder containing photographs, documents, and personal notes related to my service. Evidence of operations I couldn't discuss but needed to remember. Vietnam in 2010 was nothing like the war-torn country I had left in 1969. Ho Chi Minh City bustled with commerce, technology, and a vibrant energy that spoke to the resilience of the Vietnamese people. The countryside, when our group traveled north toward Hanoi, showed signs of prosperity and development that would have been unimaginable during the war years. But beneath the surface of modern Vietnam, I could sense the lingering presence of the conflict that had shaped both our nations. Our reconciliation group consisted of 12 American veterans and was hosted by a Vietnamese organization that facilitated meetings between former combatants. The stated purpose was to promote understanding, healing, and friendship between people who had once been enemies. The Vietnamese veterans we met were men of my generation who had served in the North Vietnamese Army or Viet Cong forces. They were farmers, teachers, small business owners, and retirees who had built productive lives after the war. Most spoke some English, and all demonstrated a remarkable capacity for forgiveness and reconciliation. But I could see in their eyes the same shadows that haunted American veterans, the psychological scars left by experiences that could never be fully explained or understood by those who hadn't lived through them. During our 3rd day in country, we visited a village near Hue, where our group was invited to participate in a traditional ceremony honoring local war dead. The ceremony took place at a small shrine dedicated to villagers who had died during the conflict, and it involved elaborate rituals of ancestor worship that I recognized from my research into Vietnamese spiritual practices. As I watched the families perform their sacred obligations to the dead, burning incense, offering food, speaking to the spirits of their ancestors, I was overwhelmed by the realization that these were the exact beliefs we had weaponized during Operation Wandering Soul. After the ceremony, I found myself in conversation with an elderly man named Nguyen Van Duc, the same name as the soldier whose supposed voice we had used in one of our recordings, though I knew this couldn't be the same person.
Through our interpreter, he told me about his experiences during the war. I was a radio operator with a unit that fought near the DMZ, he said, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke. We experienced many strange things during those years. Sometimes at night, we would hear voices in the jungle, voices of dead comrades calling to us, telling us to abandon our positions and go home. My heart stopped. I was listening to someone who had been directly affected by our psychological operations. These voices were very disturbing, he continued. Some of my comrades believed they were real spirits, angry ancestors, warning us about the dangers of fighting so far from home.
Others thought they were tricks played by American forces, but they sounded so real, so full of pain and longing. He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that seemed to see through my carefully maintained composure. The voices affected our morale very badly. Some soldiers became convinced they were being haunted by dead relatives who disapproved of their military service. A few had complete breakdowns and had to be sent home. Even those of us who suspected the voices were artificial couldn't escape their psychological impact. Through the interpreter, I asked him how these experiences had affected him personally. I have never been able to participate fully in ancestor worship ceremonies, he admitted. During the war, I became afraid that my own ancestors were angry with me for fighting instead of caring for my family. Even now, 40 years later, I sometimes hear those voices in my dreams. They remind me of a time when I questioned everything I believed about duty, family, and spiritual obligation. The conversation continued for another hour, with Nguyen describing the long-term psychological effects of what he had experienced during the war. He spoke about nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent fear that he had somehow violated his spiritual obligations to his ancestors. I was listening to a first-hand account of the psychological damage we had inflicted through Operation Wandering Soul. When our conversation ended, I asked the interpreter if I could speak privately with Nguyen. Through her, I offered a general apology for America's conduct during the war, acknowledging that some of our tactics had caused unnecessary suffering to Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. Nguyen listened carefully to my words, then responded with a grace that I didn't deserve. War makes all soldiers do things they regret. The important thing is that we can meet now as friends, that we can honor our dead together, and that we can work to ensure such conflicts never happen again. His forgiveness was more than I had any right to expect, but it couldn't absolve me of the specific role I had played in his suffering. As I walked away from that conversation, I realized that I had just apologized to someone whose mind I had helped torture 50 years earlier. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable, but it also provided a clarity I had been seeking for decades. I couldn't undo what we had done, but I could ensure that the truth about our operations was preserved and that the human cost of psychological warfare was never forgotten. The apology I had offered was inadequate, but it was a beginning. Returning from Vietnam in 2010, I began to see disturbing parallels between the psychological warfare techniques we had developed 50 years earlier and the information operations being conducted in contemporary conflicts around the world. The technology had evolved dramatically, but the fundamental principles remained the same.
Identify your target's deepest beliefs and fears, then weaponize those vulnerabilities for strategic advantage. During my research into modern psychological operations, I discovered that many of the techniques we had pioneered in Vietnam had been adapted for use in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts where American forces faced insurgent enemies with strong cultural and religious identities. Military psychological operations units were using sophisticated audio and video technology to create propaganda materials that exploited local beliefs about death, spirituality, and family obligation. The methods were more refined than our crude ghost tapes, but the underlying strategy was identical. Attack the enemy's capacity for faith and cultural connection.
But even more disturbing was the migration of these techniques into civilian contexts. The rise of social media and digital communication had created new opportunities for psychological manipulation that made our Vietnam-era operations seem primitive by comparison. State and non-state actors were using targeted propaganda, disinformation campaigns, and emotional manipulation to influence political beliefs, social attitudes, and cultural values on a massive scale. The same principles we had used to create fake ghost voices were being applied to create fake news stories, artificial social movements, and manufactured outrage designed to destabilize democratic societies. The technology was different, but the goal was the same. Undermine people's ability to distinguish truth from fiction, reality from manipulation. I began to understand that Operation Wandering Soul hadn't been an isolated wartime experiment. It had been a prototype for forms of psychological warfare that were now being used against civilian populations around the world. Through my veteran network, I connected with former intelligence officers who had worked on information operations in more recent conflicts. Their accounts confirmed my worst fears about how our techniques had evolved and spread. One former CIA analyst told me about operations in the Middle East where psychological warfare specialists had created fake religious messages designed to exploit sectarian divisions and undermine support for insurgent groups. These operations used sophisticated audio and video technology to create convincing recordings of religious leaders, dead martyrs, and spiritual figures calling for specific political actions. Another former military intelligence officer described operations in Afghanistan where psychological warfare units had created recordings of supposed dead Taliban fighters calling to their living comrades, warning them that their cause was cursed and that continuing to fight would condemn their souls to eternal punishment. The techniques we had developed for exploiting Vietnamese spiritual beliefs had been adapted for use against Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian populations in conflicts around the world. But perhaps most troubling were the accounts of how these military techniques had been adapted for use in domestic political contexts. Former intelligence officers described how foreign governments were using social media platforms to conduct psychological operations against American citizens, exploiting cultural divisions, religious beliefs, and political identities to create social instability and undermine democratic institutions. The same principles we had used to break the morale of enemy soldiers were being used to break the social cohesion of entire societies. I realized that the moral questions we had faced in Vietnam about the limits of acceptable warfare, the ethics of exploiting cultural beliefs, the long-term consequences of psychological manipulation, had become even more urgent in the digital age. The technology that enabled these operations had become more sophisticated, the reach had become global, and the targets now included civilian populations who had no idea they were being subjected to psychological warfare. Through my research, I began to understand that the guilt and trauma experienced by psychological warfare operators wasn't just a personal burden. It was a warning about the corrosive effects of these techniques on the people who used them and the societies that authorized their use. Every operator I had interviewed described similar patterns of moral injury, psychological damage, and social isolation. The work of attacking other people's beliefs and cultural identities had damaged our own capacity for faith, connection, and meaning. We had become casualties of our own weapons. But the most disturbing realization was that these techniques were now being used on such a massive scale that entire societies were experiencing the kind of psychological fragmentation that had once been limited to individual soldiers in combat zones. Social media platforms had become delivery systems for psychological operations that targeted millions of people simultaneously, exploiting their deepest fears, beliefs, and cultural identities for political and economic advantage. The ghost voices we had created in Vietnam jungles had evolved into algorithmic systems that could generate personalized psychological manipulation for every individual user, targeting their specific vulnerabilities with unprecedented precision and scale. I began to see my confession not just as an attempt at personal redemption, but as a warning about the direction our society was heading. The techniques we had developed for warfare were now being used in peacetime against civilian populations by actors who understood the power of psychological manipulation, but not its moral costs. If we didn't learn from the mistakes of Operation Wandering Soul, if we didn't understand the human cost of weaponizing belief and cultural identity, we risked creating a world where truth, faith, and authentic human connection became impossible to distinguish from manufactured manipulation. The legacy of what we had done in Vietnam wasn't just the individual soldiers we had broken. It was a template for breaking entire societies, and that template was being used against us. Sitting here in my study today, with only weeks left to live, I understand that this confession is both an act of accountability and a desperate warning about the world we're creating. The cancer in my lungs is spreading faster than the doctors predicted, but the urgency I feel isn't just about my approaching death. It's about the realization that the techniques we developed in Vietnam have evolved into something far more dangerous than anything we could have imagined 50 years ago. Over the past decade, I've watched as the principles of psychological warfare we pioneered have been adapted and deployed against civilian populations on a scale that dwarfs anything we did during the war.
Social media platforms, political campaigns, and foreign influence operations now use sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that make our crude ghost tapes seem primitive by comparison. But the fundamental strategy remains the same. Identify people's deepest beliefs, fears, and cultural attachments, then weaponize those vulnerabilities to achieve strategic objectives. The difference is that these operations are no longer limited to military conflicts or foreign enemies. They're being used against ordinary citizens in democratic societies, exploiting their religious beliefs, political identities, and cultural values to create division, confusion, and social instability. We've created a world where the line between authentic belief and manufactured manipulation has become impossible to distinguish. I've spent the last 5 years trying to contact journalists, historians, and government officials who might be willing to preserve the truth about Operation Wandering Soul and its long-term implications. The response has been mixed. Some are interested in the historical aspects of psychological warfare in Vietnam, but few seem to understand the connection between our wartime operations and contemporary information warfare. The classification restrictions that have kept our operations secret for 50 years continue to limit what I can reveal publicly. Even now, facing death, I'm constrained by secrecy agreements that could result in prosecution if I disclosed specific operational details or intelligence sources.
But I can share the moral lessons we learned, the psychological costs we experienced, and the warnings we would offer to future generations about the dangers of weaponizing human belief and cultural identity. The most important lesson is that psychological warfare damages everyone it touches, not just the targets, but the operators, the commanders, and the societies that authorize its use. Every person I've interviewed who participated in psychological operations has described similar patterns of moral injury. We became complicit in attacks on the fundamental human capacity for faith, love, and cultural connection. We learned to see other people's deepest beliefs as vulnerabilities to be exploited, rather than sacred aspects of human dignity to be respected. That moral corruption didn't end when we left the military. It affected our ability to form authentic relationships, to participate in our own cultural and spiritual communities, and to trust our own beliefs and emotions. We became casualties of our own weapons, damaged by the work of damaging others. The second lesson is that psychological warfare techniques, once developed, inevitably spread beyond their original military applications. The methods we created for use against enemy soldiers in Vietnam were later adapted for use against civilian populations in other conflicts. Those techniques have now evolved into information warfare capabilities that are being used against democratic societies by foreign adversaries and domestic political actors. The ghost voices we created in jungle recording studios have become algorithmic systems that can generate personalized psychological manipulation for millions of people simultaneously, targeting their specific vulnerabilities with unprecedented precision and scale. The third lesson is that societies that authorize psychological warfare against their enemies inevitably become vulnerable to the same techniques being used against them. The psychological operations capabilities we developed to fight the Vietnam War have been studied, copied and improved by adversaries who now use similar techniques against American citizens. We taught the world how to weaponize belief and cultural identity, and now those weapons are being turned against us. The final lesson is that some forms of warfare are so fundamentally corrupting that they should never be used, regardless of their tactical effectiveness. Psychological operations that attack people's capacity for faith, love, and cultural connection don't just defeat enemies. They degrade the moral foundation of the societies that employ them. They create a world where authentic human connection becomes impossible to distinguish from strategic manipulation. I'm sharing this confession because I believe people need to understand what psychological warfare really means. Not the sanitized version presented in military histories or academic studies, but the human cost of weaponizing the most sacred aspects of human experience. The techniques we developed in Vietnam are now being used on a global scale, targeting civilian populations through social media, political campaigns, and information warfare operations that most people don't even recognize as attacks. If we don't learn from the mistakes of Operation Wandering Soul, if we don't understand the moral costs of psychological manipulation, we risk creating a world where truth, faith, and authentic human connection become impossible. The ghost voices we created 50 years ago have evolved into something far more dangerous, a comprehensive assault on the human capacity for belief, trust, and cultural identity. And we're all targets now. This confession is my attempt to warn you about what's coming and to ask for forgiveness I know I don't deserve. The voices are calling, and this time they're calling to all of us.
If you take nothing else from my confession, understand this. The capacity for psychological manipulation that we unleashed in Vietnam has evolved into the greatest threat facing human civilization today. I'm not speaking in hyperbole or conspiracy theories. I'm telling you what I've learned from 50 years of carrying the guilt of psychological warfare, from decades of research into how our techniques have spread and evolved, and from watching our society fragment under the weight of manufactured manipulation. The ghost voices we created in Vietnam were primitive compared to what exists today. We could target individual soldiers or small units with recordings designed to exploit their specific cultural beliefs and personal vulnerabilities. Today's psychological operations can target millions of people simultaneously, using artificial intelligence and big data to craft personalized manipulation for every individual user. Your social media feeds, your news sources, your political information, even your entertainment choices are being shaped by algorithmic systems that understand your psychological vulnerabilities better than you understand them yourself. These systems know what you fear, what you love, what you believe, and what you doubt. They use that knowledge to influence your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways that serve strategic objectives you're not even aware of. The same principles we use to break enemy soldiers' connection to their cultural beliefs and spiritual practices are now being used to break your connection to truth, community, and authentic human experience. But unlike our operations in Vietnam, which targeted foreign enemies during wartime,
Today's psychological warfare is being conducted against civilian populations during peacetime by actors who may be foreign governments, domestic political organizations, or commercial entities seeking to profit from social division and confusion. You are living through a psychological warfare campaign right now, and most people don't even realize it's happening.
The warning signs are everywhere if you know how to recognize them. When you find yourself feeling inexplicably angry or afraid after consuming media content, when your political beliefs become more extreme without clear rational justification, when you begin to distrust institutions, communities, or relationships that previously provided stability and meaning, these may be symptoms of psychological manipulation. The techniques we developed for exploiting Vietnam's spiritual beliefs have been adapted to exploit American political beliefs, religious convictions, cultural identities, and social relationships. The goal is the same: undermine your capacity for independent thought, authentic connection, and meaningful participation in democratic society. But there are ways to protect yourself and your community from these attacks. First, develop media literacy skills that help you recognize manipulation techniques. Learn to identify emotional manipulation, logical fallacies, and information that seems designed to provoke strong emotional responses rather than inform or educate. Be especially suspicious of content that makes you feel angry, afraid, or superior to other groups of people. Second, diversify your information sources and actively seek out perspectives that challenge your existing beliefs. Psychological manipulation works by creating echo chambers that reinforce your biases and isolate you from contradictory information. Break out of those chambers by engaging with people and ideas that make you uncomfortable. Third, maintain strong connections to local communities, institutions, and relationships that exist outside of digital spaces. Psychological warfare is most effective against isolated individuals who lack strong social support networks. Build and maintain real-world relationships that can provide perspective and stability when digital manipulation becomes overwhelming. Fourth, practice critical thinking skills that help you distinguish between authentic information and manufactured content. Learn to verify sources, check facts, and question the motivations behind the information you consume. Develop the habit of asking, who benefits if I believe this? What am I being encouraged to think, feel, or do? Finally, understand that psychological warfare is designed to make you feel powerless, isolated, and unable to distinguish truth from fiction. The antidote to these feelings is active engagement with your community, your democratic institutions, and your own capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. The ghost voices we created in Vietnam were designed to convince enemy soldiers that their ancestors disapproved of their actions, that their cultural beliefs were meaningless, and that resistance was futile. Today's psychological operations are designed to convince you that your democratic institutions are corrupt, that your fellow citizens are enemies, and that meaningful change is impossible. Don't let them succeed. The techniques of psychological warfare are powerful, but they're not invincible. They depend on your isolation, your fear, and your willingness to surrender your capacity for independent thought and authentic connection.
Fight back by staying connected to truth, to community, and to the values that make human civilization worth preserving. The voices are calling to all of us now, trying to lead us away from each other and into the darkness of manufactured division and despair. But unlike the soldiers we targeted in Vietnam, you have been warned. You know what's happening, and you have the power to resist. Use it. The psychological warfare techniques developed during the Vietnam War have evolved into sophisticated information operations that target civilian populations today. If this story has opened your eyes to the hidden manipulation that shapes our digital world, hit that like button to support more investigations into the forces trying to control our thoughts and beliefs. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the historical events that continue to shape our present reality.
Understanding the past is the key to recognizing the patterns that threaten our future. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now for another eye-opening exploration of how military technologies and tactics have been adapted for use against civilian populations in ways most people never realize. Stay vigilant, question everything, and remember, the most dangerous weapons are the ones that attack your mind without you knowing it.